Right, afternoon everyone. I'm going to give a fairly helicopter overview of BNG and units generally, so I'm happy for you to stop and ask for clarification or be corrected if anything I get wrong. So we heard on the film about, obviously you know about the ecological emergency, climate emergency. We're losing species hand over fist. That's global, but particularly in a UK context. And that's largely, we know that the UK is very good at going out and telling other countries how to do their conservation, but we have one of the most nature-deprived countries in the world. And a lot of that natural loss is due to habitat loss. So it's habitat damage. Now, in the case of the UK, that's not because there's not enough space. It's because the habitat we've got is in poor condition. It's because it's been developed sometimes inappropriately. We do need to use that habitat. We need to grow food, we need to live on it, we need to work, we need to extract natural resources. But there is room, it just can be managed better. And the crisis we're now in, that's the driver for the 30 by 30 targets as mentioned. And in terms of BNG, the idea is that developers potentially can be less of a problem in terms of habitat damage by replacing, compensating for habitat that's damaged by development, but by the idea of the net gain to add something on and become potentially part of the solution. Might be a bit ambitious, but it is an ambitious programme in many ways. So in terms of BNG, we've got a bit of a head start in terms of Cornwall Council because we did pilot since 2020, 110% net gain, so got a little bit of experience ahead of the mandatory net gain that's come in, which has come in as mandatory from this year, so it's brand new, still evolving. Having said that, it's taken 20 years to get there, so it has been quite well devised. And also those drivers of habitat loss that I mentioned, they've been there for a long time as well. So the earliest BNG attempt I know about is in the 1970s in America, where they tried to essentially get biodiversity net gain on developments, couldn't produce a system that worked and stuck and could be complied with. Similarly in Australia and in Canada and other places around the world. In the UK, we've now managed to get a mandatory, legally required system in place with processes involved that it's going to evolve, it's going to take time to shake out and see how it works, but it would appear to be delivering for nature, being looked at in a very interested way internationally and is being adopted by a number of other countries as well. So it is quite a pioneering approach. Big things about it, so if you sign up for BNG in our current system that we've got, you're locked in for 30 years, or that land is locked in for 30 years by new legal instruments in some cases. It's based on area, and it's also based on these linear units, so either hedgerows or watercourses. That's going into a bit of the detail, but it's necessary, I'm afraid. I'm sure all of you have heard about BNG. Some of you know a great deal about it, some a bit less. Probably not many people will know some of the complications of it, and there's no shame in that, because it is a very, very complicated process and has developed as so and is changing as we speak almost, but it's settling down and being put into action as we go. So BNG, very simple idea. You put concrete on something, you get a net loss of the biodiversity. You require that biodiversity to be replaced. That's been tried a few times, hasn't worked. It still ends up as a net loss. So that brought the idea of the biodiversity net gain, that you require any development to replace, compensate for what's lost and add something on. But some of the detail, still fairly simple, but the requirement at the moment is to try and drive that replacement or compensation where necessary as close to the development as possible. So ideally, you don't take it away in the first place. That might involve changing the plan of your housing development, maybe leaving a couple of houses out, which affects the economics, so you can leave some nature in there. Alternatively, you can develop it on site, plant a few trees, have a reed bed, bit of green area, and hopefully do it on site. And at present, it looks like more on-site delivery of BNG has been achieved than initially expected. But that may change fairly rapidly over time. So if you can't do it on your site, you can get off-site units, which ideally should still be as near as possible. Various regulations around that. In Cornwall, probably anywhere in Cornwall will work, which isn't necessarily appropriate for nature, but that's to be discussed and looked at and developed. But you can get these off-site units. So developing on-site, that would almost always be the cheapest option. Off-site, we've got down there 25,000 to 35,000 a unit as an average. I was on a webinar yesterday that puts that nationally at an average of about 45,000, because it's probably going up, it's probably not going to go down. They're not making any more land, so there's always going to be that requirement. But that whole supply and demand around BNG is a little bit unknown at the moment. Still developing, still evolving. If you can't even get off-site credits, which is going to be the case in a few things, there are statutory credits managed by Natural England. They're deliberately priced to get you not to do that, because that's generally going to be further away, a long way away from your development. So they're priced very high. Nonetheless, apparently I believe they've sold one statutory credit so far. So there's still that demand. You know, if you're building in the middle of London and you've managed to find a site to build on, it's going to be very hard to get anything nearby to replace that with in terms of ecological equivalence. So you might have to go off-site, and it might be worth worth that in terms of the price of the development as well. Again, has to be seen how the market develops on that. But you know, some units have been stated as priced by Natural England as 650,000 plus, depending on the type of habitat, where it is, and so on. The off-site units that we mentioned here, there's no fixed price. It's all market demand. The issue is about how to measure it. So BNG is specifically to make sure that habitats are left in a measurably better state. And the measurably is where the complication comes in, because BNG is an intangible asset. You can't pick it up, weigh it, smell it. It's hard enough to count it. So it's quite difficult to do that. So it's being done in our current system, and this is what is fairly revolutionary internationally. It's measured in biodiversity units using a metric that I'll come on to. And it's using, we say biodiversity, but we're using the habitat as a proxy. The assumption is that you make a nice habitat and all the nature will come and live with it. It's not a bad assumption to make, but it's, you know, there are some issues there as well, potentially. So a given habitat will contain not just one unit, but a number of units. And that will depend on the size of the area, the quality of the habitat on it, the location. So again, this is where the complication comes into the measuring that goes into this metric that I'll come on to. So things like habitat size, habitat condition, habitat distinctiveness, you know how important is that as a habitat? How close is it to being at optimum ecological function? Strategically, is it significant? So these things, you know, they're not straight one-offs, which is why the legislation requires a competent ecologist to do it. It's not specifically specified what a competent ecologist is, but you do have to have quite a lot of letters after your name and quite a lot of experience. And you require a competent ecologist to measure the current biodiversity, so what is it on the area that's been developed that's there already, and then to advise on what you can do afterwards to create habitat or enhance what's there. And actually calculating the units is essentially the biggest Excel sheet in the world, which is the statutory biodiversity metric, which again I think is quite unique in that it's a legal instrument that it's required. Can't be fiddled with. Obviously you can put in different values for some things as required, but other things have calculators and macros in there which measure the units. Again, comes up with a figure ping before development, and for the plan you have what you're going to do afterwards, whether on-site or off-site, to make sure you compensate for 110% of that loss. Just as to visualise, if you're not working on things, how many BNG units you can create. So various things you can put in, the off-site baseline, how many years does it take to create it? Is it in a local strategy in terms of that significance? Is it formally in a local strategy, or is it informally agreed it's an important or not important site? What's the condition, poor to good, distinctiveness? There's also various risk factors that go in there as well. So all of these go into the various calculations, and just as it's a guesstimate, but if you're going just from arable, so a ploughed field, to neutral grassland, now at the moment there's something over 50 different types of grassland, including all little subcategories. So you know, grassland isn't a straightforward habitat. Neutral grassland, fairly neutral actually, so it should be relatively easy to achieve. Reasonable biodiversity, 7, 8, 9 species per square metre or something. And on a hectare, a rugby field, you could expect to get something like 9.5 units, reasonably. Depends on other factors, soil condition, where you are, but that's and at 45,000 a unit, suddenly the numbers get pretty high there. Remember, it's over 30 years. You've got to cover all the costs of establishing it, managing it, other things and risks. So it does thin out, but there are big numbers involved potentially. As another example, you're going from modified grassland, which we have a lot of in Cornwall. So it's fertilised grassland. It's been reseeded with fast-growing rice grasses and so on. Virtually no species diversity in it, but it is grassland. And you're going to change that to neutral grassland with a higher species diversity, slightly more biodiversity value. You're still going to get 7.5 units in a rugby field. So it's still quite significant. Interestingly, if you went from a ploughed field to broadleaf woodland, you only get 3.5 odd units. And you think that's a bit counterintuitive. But the reason for that is it's quite difficult to establish a woodland because all the deer come and nibble the tops off. Or you get a drought and it kills them all. And it takes, over 30 years supposed to be doing this. After 20 years, you've still got really quite a lot of big sticks stuck in the ground, not a forest. So getting to a good condition takes a long time, so it doesn't score very well in the metric. What I should have put in as a good example here is scrub. So if you're going from a ploughed field to just scrub, that scores really well because it's easy to establish, very good for all sorts of biodiversity, and very risk-free to produce. Obviously, the problem is if you're farming of any sort, you can't graze that, you can't take a cut off it. It's of very little use as a human artifact, though it's good for the nature. That's just indicative sort of examples to visualise it. Which brings us to the issue of the markets in the future. So I've been talking primarily about the planning market, which is now mandatory virtually for all sites. There's a slight difference between big sites and little sites, and there are a number of exemptions and things, but it's a mandatory market. It's one of the first of its kind in the world, and it's going to develop and be very important. Hopefully it will be important for nature and will still enable developments to go ahead. Those of you at the breakfast this morning will have heard how important it is for new housing for businesses in Cornwall. That's one of the big constraints. So we do need to do development. So that's the mandatory market, and so that's required. We thought it would be quite easy to sort of predict demand and so on. It's not proving as quite as easy as we thought. But that's there, that's going to develop. It's not going away. And prices will probably rise. It's going to be significant and, as I say, hopefully strategically important for nature as well. There's also an increasing, using the BNG metric, still going through the whole process, but a voluntary market, where because it's going through a very well tried and tested and developed metric that comes out with a number Bing, it gives integrity to what somebody's buying in terms of, I want to do something good for nature. As discussions for those who are in earlier meetings, how do you again get a tangible outcome from an investment? So a lot of the drivers for that is ESG and CSR from companies. So they are buying voluntary BNG. Also increasingly, and I hear quite fast increasing, is that investors in companies are requiring BNG as an example of a high integrity outcome before they'll invest in a company to support it, because it avoids that greenwash charge, which is quite a threat. Which brings us on to high integrity markets. So again, I mentioned that the habitat is being used as a proxy for biodiversity. In East Anglia, they've produced some BNG and then stuck some birdsong recorders on it with AI to identify the birds, which then identified that there are a number of rare birds coming repeatedly year after year, which adds that integrity of knowing that you have not just won your BNG targets, but you've increased the biodiversity, provably, on it. So that becomes a high integrity BNG, which then got sold at a higher price, which is an interesting model to go down. And maybe something that, again, both voluntary and mandatory could be of interest. Particularly where a developer is interested in that backstory of producing demonstrably they're doing something locally in replacement for a development that's happening that might be protested against. Which brings us very quickly to carbon as high integrity. So one of the offers we're giving under the LINC programme is a sort of a relatively light touch feasibility study of BNG for a farmer, landowner can come to us and we can give a feasibility approach. Is it worthwhile going down that BNG approach? And if so, then what steps can you take to do that? We're also looking at particularly carbon units, and in wilder carbon units is gaining a lot of traction, as they say, as an accredited carbon unit. Now, I'm sure you'll know that the carbon markets, particularly in the UK, we're ahead on BNG internationally, we're behind on carbon. So we don't have a mandated or particularly regulated carbon market. So if you came to me and said, I feel guilty about going to Mallorca, flying there, and I want to offset my carbon, well, I can get a red crayon on a piece of A4 paper and write, this is 30 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. For you, at current market prices, that's 300 quid, please. And that would be perfectly legal. Now, I'm being completely unfair there, because there are reasonably well testified carbon codes. So woodland carbon, peatland carbon, I believe they've just sold the first soil codes in the carbon units in the UK. So it is developing, but they are self-regulated markets, unlike in California, Australia, parts of Europe, where there are regulated and mandated markets. And that will almost certainly be coming to the UK sometime soon. And wilder carbon is one of those units there that's vying to be in there as well regulated, well trusted, well tried. And it also incorporates the BNG metric as part of the carbon assessment itself to add that integrity. And we're training up in the process, Mike and myself, to offer that as a validation process, both for buyers need to be validated, as well as the projects. The big thing being, again, it's avoiding that greenwashing, which is becoming a big issue for not just companies, but for the investors in those companies. Which brings potential actual investment opportunities. So again, on the learning curve on this, fairly low down the slopes, but for a wilder carbon project, a company can invest now, which then guarantees that they get a take of carbon units that are produced later on. That can be for their own use. Potentially, it could be for trading, should such a trading carbon market evolve in the UK, as it has in, say, California. But it's an incentive for a company to get involved now is seed funding to get a project up and running, to get it to be wilder carbon ready, that then guarantees them a pipeline of those carbon units down the road. Again, that's the sort of market mechanism that's evolving, and we're trying to support projects to get into that market, to engage in that investment route.